Picture this. It is roughly 22,000 years ago, and a small group of humans is camped along the edge of a river valley in what is now southern France. They have lived here for 2 seasons. They know where the deer cross at dawn, where the flint deposits are, where the wind dies down enough to sleep. They have built something rare in the Ice Age familiarity. And then, over the course of a single brutal winter, the river changes course. The deer do not come back, and the valley fills with a wind so cold and constant that no fire can hold against it. Within weeks, the food is gone. Within a few more, the people who stayed are gone too. The ones who survived were not stronger. They were not smarter in the way we usually measure intelligence. They survived because they did something that sounds almost too simple. They left. They abandoned everything familiar and moved into unknown landscape before it was too late. And that decision, that ability to detach from place and trust in motion, is arguably the single most important survival behavior in all of human history. Not fire, not language, not tools, movement. Because in the Ice Age, staying still was the closest thing to a death sentence that nature could write. Here is something that gets almost no attention in mainstream history. Humans are extraordinarily fragile animals. Compared to virtually every large Ice Age predator or prey species, Homo sapiens arrived at the worst possible biological configuration for cold climate survival. We have almost no natural insulation. Our body fat percentage, even in well-fed modern humans, is nowhere near what Arctic-adapted mammals carry. A polar bear can store enough fat to survive months without food. A woolly mammoth carried reserves that would fuel its body through the most catastrophic winters. A human adult in Ice Age conditions, burning between 3,000 and 5,000 calories per day just to maintain core temperature and hunt effectively, could begin experiencing dangerous metabolic decline within days of food scarcity. This is not a minor detail. This is an extinction pressure built directly into our biology. It meant that every human group, every single season, was operating on an extremely narrow margin between survival and collapse. There was no meaningful biological buffer, no fat reserve to coast on, no hibernation option, no instinctive migration pattern hardwired by evolution the way it is in birds or caribou. Humans had to consciously engineer their own survival, and the most powerful tool they had was not a spear or a hand axe. It was the willingness and the knowledge to move. The Ice Age environment is often imagined as a static, frozen landscape, endless white, slow-moving glaciers, unchanging cold. That image is almost completely wrong. The last glacial maximum, which peaked around 20,000 years ago, was not a stable ice age. It was a volatility machine. Climate scientists studying ice core records from Greenland have documented events called Dansgaard-Oeschger cycles, rapid climate oscillations in which regional temperatures could shift by 8 to 15 degrees Celsius within decades, sometimes within a single human lifetime. Ecosystems that had supported dense animal populations could reorganize entirely in a generation. What this meant in practical terms was devastating. The reindeer herds that a group depended on could shift their migration routes by hundreds of kilometers in response to vegetation changes, triggered by a warming trend that lasted only 30 years. The river that provided water and attracted prey could change its flow patterns. The grassland that sustained bison could contract or expand based on snow depth patterns that shifted year to year. Isotope analysis of human remains and archaeological sites from this period confirms what the climate data suggests. Many hunter-gatherer groups operated across territories spanning between 500 and 2,000 square kilometers, not because they were wandering aimlessly, but because survival required covering that much ground to stay ahead of the ecosystem's instability. These people were not nomads in the romantic sense. They were environmental analysts in motion, reading a landscape that never stopped changing. Here is where most documentaries get this story wrong. They frame Ice Age mobility as a limitation, as evidence of how primitive early humans were before they figured out agriculture and finally stopped moving. But that framing inverts the actual logic completely. Mobility was not the problem that civilization solved. Mobility was the most sophisticated survival technology our species ever developed. And the evidence for this becomes undeniable when you look at what mobility was actually doing beneath the surface. Archaeological sites from the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 50,000 to 10,000 years ago, show stone tools made from materials sourced 200 to 400 kilometers from where those tools were found and used. This is not accidental. It represents deliberate, repeated travel along remembered corridors across landscapes that most modern humans would find completely impassable. These were not random movements. They were engineered routes, refined across generations, stored not in any written record but in the most reliable archive available, human memory. Ice Age humans were not surviving despite their mobility. They were surviving because of a mobility system so complex and well-maintained that it functioned as the operational backbone of every other survival strategy they had. What Ice Age groups were practicing, without ever naming it, was a form of risk engineering that would not be formally described in human literature for another 20,000 years. The core logic was this: never let your survival depend on a single point of failure. If your group relied on one hunting ground and that ground failed, you died. If you relied on one water source and it froze or dried up, you died. If you relied on one trade partner for tool materials and contact was lost, your technological capacity degraded. The solution to all of these risks was the same. Distribute your survival across geography, across social networks, across seasonal patterns, so that no single failure could collapse the entire system. Modern supply chain engineers call this redundancy. Financial analysts call it diversification. Ecologists call it resilience. Ice Age humans simply called it staying alive. Groups rotated through their territories in patterns synchronized with ecological recovery rates. They moved away from a hunting ground before it was depleted, allowing animal populations to recover, allowing vegetation to regenerate, allowing the land to reset. Then they returned. This rotation was not random. Anthropological research on surviving hunter-gatherer populations suggests these cycles were maintained with remarkable precision, governed by seasonal knowledge passed down through oral tradition across dozens of generations. These people were not consuming the landscape, they were managing it. The first land stewards on Earth were not farmers. They were mobile hunter-gatherers who understood that movement was the only way to keep the land productive enough to support human life. But here is what makes this even more extraordinary. Mobility at this scale required something that no animal on Earth had ever built before: a living, portable, continuously updated knowledge infrastructure stored entirely in human minds. To navigate across 1,000 square kilometers of Ice Age terrain, you needed to know where water remained unfrozen longest into winter. You needed to know the specific valley passes where wind exposure was low enough to survive a night crossing. You needed to know which rock outcroppings contained the right flint for tool manufacture, which riverbanks held clay suitable for construction, which slopes offered natural shelter against the dominant wind direction. You needed to remember not just where food was, but where food had been 2 seasons ago, and where it would likely be next spring based on what the current weather patterns suggested. This was not instinct. It was accumulated intelligence, maintained, tested, and transmitted across generations through storytelling, ritual, and demonstration. Researchers studying the spatial memory systems of contemporary hunter-gatherer groups have documented individuals capable of mentally mapping thousands of named locations across enormous territories with geographic accuracy that rivals modern cartographic tools. That cognitive capacity did not appear from nowhere. It was built and refined across tens of thousands of years of selection pressure, created by exactly this challenge: survive by knowing where to go, or die because you did not. Mobility did not just keep bodies alive. It built the human brain into what it is. Isolation, in the Ice Age, was not peaceful solitude. It was a slow execution. A small group operating in complete isolation faced compounding risks that went far beyond food scarcity. Genetic bottlenecks, the loss of biological diversity in a small, closed population, could degrade immune function and reproductive viability within a few generations. A single catastrophic hunting accident that killed 2 or 3 adults in a group of 20 could collapse the group's capacity to survive the next winter. A single bad season without external support could push an isolated population past the point of recovery. Mobility solved this problem by making isolation impossible to maintain. When groups moved through overlapping territories, they created contact. Contact created exchange. Archaeological evidence documents not just the movement of raw materials across hundreds of kilometers, but also the spread of specific tool-making techniques, distinctive blade geometries, particular hafting methods that appear simultaneously across geographically separated sites. This is the signature of an information network in operation. Ideas were traveling with the people, jumping between groups at meeting points, spreading innovations faster than any isolated population could generate them independently. Some paleoanthropologists now argue that this network connectivity is a central explanation for why Homo sapiens expanded successfully across the planet, while other human species, including Neanderthals, who were physically robust, cold-adapted, and technologically capable, ultimately disappeared. Neanderthal populations appear to have operated in smaller, more geographically restricted networks. Homo sapiens built continental-scale social webs through mobility, and when environments became catastrophic, the species with the larger network had more options, more knowledge, more genetic diversity, and more allies to draw on. The social network was not an invention of modernity. It was built in the Ice Age, one migration corridor at a time. Stop for a moment and consider what all of this required neurologically. To survive through mobility, not just to move, but to move intelligently, across changing terrain, across seasons. Across social boundaries, a human brain needed to do things that no other animal brain was doing at the same level. It needed to hold detailed spatial maps of landscapes not currently visible. It needed to run predictive models of where animals would be based on seasonal patterns and current weather indicators. It needed to track social obligations and exchange histories across dozens of relationships with people in different groups. It needed to plan routes that balanced multiple competing risks: food availability, weather exposure, territorial overlap with other groups, distance to reliable water. It needed to communicate all of this in enough detail that other group members could act on it effectively. Neuroscientists studying the hippocampus, the brain region most associated with spatial navigation and episodic memory, have found that its size and connectivity scale directly with the navigational demands placed on an AII organism. London taxi drivers, who memorized the city's 25,000 street layout before licensing, show measurable hippocampal enlargement compared to non-taxi drivers. Birds that cache food across thousands of locations show dramatically larger hippocampal volumes than related species that do not. The implication for Ice Age humans is significant. Tens of thousands of years of survival pressure that selected for navigational intelligence, seasonal prediction, and route memory did not leave our brains unchanged. Mobility did not just save the human species. It may have fundamentally shaped the cognitive architecture that makes human intelligence distinctive in the first place. We did not just evolve big brains. We evolved moving brains. Brains built to simulate futures, model landscapes, and survive the unknown. This brings us to one of the most consequential questions in human evolution. Why are we here, and our closest relatives are not? Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia for approximately 300,000 years. They used fire, made tools, buried their dead, and showed evidence of symbolic thinking. By any reasonable measure, they were not primitive. They were a successful human species with deep roots in their home environments, and those deep roots may have been precisely what made them vulnerable. Neanderthal populations appear to have been highly regionalized. Their tool technologies show less evidence of the long-distance material exchange that characterizes Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens sites. Their genetic data, recovered from fossil remains, suggests smaller effective population sizes and less admixture between geographically separated groups, consistent with a less connected, more territorially fixed social structure. When the Dansgaard-Oeschger climate instability of 40,000 to 30,000 years ago reorganized European ecosystems with particular severity, Neanderthal populations contracted toward refugia, small pockets of habitable terrain, and could not maintain the network connectivity needed to sustain viable population sizes across their range. Homo sapiens, arriving from Africa with a social and cognitive system already adapted to operating across vast, unstable, heterogeneous landscapes, did not contract. They expanded. Not because they were smarter in some abstract sense, but because their survival system was built for exactly the conditions that Neanderthals were not prepared to handle. Flexibility, when the filter is severe enough, beats specialization every single time. There is one more consequence of mobility that does not get the recognition it deserves. It created cumulative culture, the mechanism by which human knowledge compounds instead of resetting with each generation. Every species has some capacity to learn and transmit behavior, but most animal knowledge transmission is limited by the size and connectivity of the social group. A chimpanzee troop might develop a clever food processing technique, but if the troop is isolated, the innovation stays local. If the troop collapses, the innovation disappears. Ice Age human mobility broke that constraint by creating a landscape in which innovations could propagate across populations before they could be lost. A more effective spear design discovered by a group in the Rhine Valley could reach groups in Iberia within a generation through the social network created by overlapping migration corridors. A new method for waterproofing hide clothing could spread from northern groups to southern ones before the winter that made that knowledge critical. Innovations did not die with their inventors. They traveled, they merged with other innovations, they improved through combination, and they spread again. This is the fundamental engine of human technological progress, not individual genius, but networked knowledge propagation. And it was running at full speed 30,000 years before the first city was built. The civilization that eventually produced writing, mathematics, and space travel was not a new phenomenon. It was the latest expression of a knowledge compounding system that was first activated by Ice Age mobility. Here is the reframe that most history books will never give you. We are taught that human history has two great chapters: the long, primitive era of hunter-gatherers, and then civilization, agriculture, cities, writing, progress. The transition is framed as a discontinuity. Humans stopped moving, started farming, and history finally began. But look at what civilization actually is at its structural core. Trade routes are mobility systems. Shipping lanes are mobility systems. Road networks are mobility systems. Financial markets are information mobility systems. The internet is the most powerful mobility system ever constructed, moving not bodies but data across the entire planet in milliseconds. Civilization did not replace mobility. It scaled it, accelerated it, and made it invisible beneath infrastructure. Cities are not places where movement stopped. They are nodes where movement concentrates. Ports, markets, universities, capital cities, every engine of civilizational progress has always been a hub in a mobility network, a place where things and ideas and people from distant origins arrive, combine, and then disperse again as something new. The Ice Age hunter-gatherer moving along a 300-kilometer corridor between winter camp and summer hunting ground, carrying tool materials from a distant source and knowledge from the last group encountered at a river crossing, was doing something structurally identical to what a modern global supply chain does. The scale is different, the technology is different, the underlying logic is exactly the same. We did not transcend our Ice Age origins when civilization began. We automated them. So here is the question that the standard history of human civilization almost never asks. What if the most important chapter of the human story did not begin with the first city, or the first written word, or the first harvest? What if it began 30,000 years ago, in an unrecorded moment when a group of humans looked at a valley that was failing them, felt every instinct toward familiarity pulling them to stay, and chose to leave anyway into cold, into unknown terrain, into risk they could not fully calculate? That choice, repeated across thousands of groups and hundreds of thousands of years, selected for every cognitive trait that eventually built civilization. The planning capacity, the social trust, the information-sharing impulse, the ability to imagine a future different from the present. Every one of those traits was stress-tested and refined by the Ice Age mobility system long before a single seed was planted in domesticated soil. We think of ourselves as the civilization-building species, but we are, at the deepest level, the moving species, the adapting species. The species that survives not by dominating one environment, but by being able to function in all of them. The Ice Age did not just test us, it built us. And the next time you feel the pull to stay somewhere comfortable long past the point where it is serving you, remember that the most successful survival strategy in human evolutionary history was always the same. Read the environment honestly, recognize when it is changing, and move before it is too late. If you want more documentaries on prehistoric survival, the hidden engineering of ancient human behavior, and the deep origins of the systems that still run the modern world, subscribe to Prehistoric Shadows. Because the most important chapters of human history were written long before history began.